All right, so got it. Any problem seeing the screen? We're all good? Okay, great, great. Well, thank you all for having me here. Thank you, Nicole, for the invitation to be able to share this work with all of you. I'm kind of glad that there isn't a case because I tend to talk way too much. And so this might take a little bit longer. I get too excited about this stuff and then I end up going off on all kinds of tangents. So uh, apologies in advance for all of that. As I mentioned, I am in the Department of Family and Community Medicine here at NeoMed. My training is actually in American literary studies. My PhD is in late 19th, early 20th century American literature. And my research looks at the intersection of literary texts and more contemporary film with histories of medicine and public health. So you'll see traces of that within this project today. Which is, working on dispelling the myth of patient zero. So thinking more about how this term that we use in the contemporary moment is something that has evolved actually over centuries and kind of where it came from and how we should potentially be thinking about that. The objectives for it first are to define patient zero, and then to spend more of the didactic presentation exploring where this myth came from. How did we come to this concept? And at the same time, then critiquing the homophobic and misogynistic foundations of this construct within our socio-cultural space as well. So I wanted to start with a little bit of input and discussion from everyone else to answer the question, who or what is patient zero? This gives me a sense of your kind of baseline and where we're coming at, but also a chance to begin this conversation. And I have up here also a headline from a relatively recent article reporting on the COVID pandemic. And I chose this because it has, who is patient zero in the coronavirus outbreak? So we have the sense then, if it's in a headline, right, that everybody's supposed to read that and know what that means. And so I'm interested if, this is being used as a rather familiar term, what does this mean? And here I am very much looking for some audience input on that. No takers. So this is a really terrible headline and nobody actually knows who patient zero is. Amy, go ahead.
No, you don't know, but it's assumed as like the first identifiable case that, that comes to light, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there anything anybody wants to add to that? Does that sum up our general understanding of that? I can only see like a handful of you, so it's hard for me to get any like facial cues here. I'm going to need verbal. No, we're done. We're not talking. All right, that's fine. And I wanted to make another quick note. It's actually conventional in literary studies for folks to read papers out loud. So I'm going to fight that impulse and try to make this a little bit more conversational. There will be times that you'll see me kind of reading. It's because we're people who really are very quite persnickety about language, and we spend a lot of time thinking about word choice and the structure of a text. And so we want to say things precisely the way we want to say them. But the other thing, as I said, I have a tendency to kind of ramble a little bit. So I may read also to try to keep myself to time. But let's start then in kind of unpacking this definition of patient zero. And Amy, you're absolutely right in that, we think very much about this being the first person to be infected during an epidemic. And we also get the sense of the first person documented, right, as a case of a communicable disease in a particular population or region. So it may not be the first person to ever have a particular disease, but just at this particular place and time. So as it functions idiomatically in the 21st century, patient zero is derived from this epidemiological concept of the index patient, which is the first known case of a novel communicable or heritable disease. But what I want to stress in defining this is that the two are actually not strictly synonymous. And we begin to see this in the definition that is provided by dictionary.com, that we have the person or thing believed to be the point of origin for any spreading effect, status, or event, especially if it's negative. So this isn't really a neutral term. We have then this sense of anything that might be negative, it spreads. We've got then, this is becoming a bit more of a loaded term, we would say. And indeed, patient zero exceeds the simple epidemiological designation of the index patient, and actually functions as what the folklorist Diane Goldstein describes as a contemporary legend, which is a localized and compelling story that shapes vernacular conceptions of prominent political and sociocultural events. So derived from the scapegoat of plague myth and then refined throughout the 20th century, patient zero actually functions as a stock character in contemporary narratives of outbreak and contagion, who, whether carelessly oblivious to the risk they pose to others or intentionally spreading sickness, engages in dangerous, quote unquote, deviant behavior, subsequently framed as the root cause of epidemics. So you see, this isn't exactly the index patient, though it is reminiscent of it, but actually patient zero is a term that's got a lot more kind of going on, though we tend to use it sometimes to mean index patient, but it is something distinct. You'll notice I used large scare quotes around deviant. Anytime you hear me use that word, please see giant glowing scare quotes around it. Deviant is a really problematic and charged term, one that is used to pathologize into anyone who doesn't fit within a culturally constructed norm. And that's been a source of prejudice and bias and discrimination for many, many communities. So I mentioned that the patient zero is a stock figure within the outbreak narrative. Outbreak narrative is a term coined by the scholar Priscilla Wald in this book, Contagious, which is really a fantastic work, but she defines the outbreak narrative as this formulaic story of disease emergence and containment that's reproduced in fiction and mass media and science writing and epidemiology, and that relies on familiar narrative tropes or conventions. And she says what's unique about the outbreak narrative is the way it shows us contagion to be both a sociocultural and a biomedical phenomenon. So I'm going to see if we get any more takers this time. Given this sort of definition of patient zero and thinking of it as related to index patient, but potentially distinct from it, what do we think is useful about the concept of patient zero, but also what is it that makes this a potentially problematic concept?
Now, I know all of you to be better, not so shy. So if anybody has thoughts, just jump in.
I'll throw one in. Perhaps it would, if inaccurate, it would take us down a deviant path, right? An alternate path that might not actually be helpful.
Right. So there's a chance of misidentifying a patient zero and then not really getting much epidemiologically useful information out of following that. Yeah. Is there anything else we can think of? Yeah.
I suppose the shame and the stigma that goes along with being that poor patient zero.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like a title one really wants to have. It seems to be, yeah, pretty loaded, and stigma, absolutely, something affixed to that.
Unless it was a fabulous cure for something and you were the first person to, but in a bad pandemic, whatever, yeah, you don't want to be patient zero.
Yeah, Typhoid Mary. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, you're already thinking ahead. Okay, I love it. This is fantastic. She'll make a cameo as well. All right.
That's actually what my son refers to his 2-year-old daughter as, because she brings home every virus all the time.
I feel that. I've got a nearly 3-year-old, and the preschool plague hits hard every 2 weeks. So yes, I feel that. Let me try to push you all at the top. So maybe I can see more than one at a time. All right, so let's dive into then thinking more about where this comes from. If we're thinking about patient zero, not simply as index patient, but something that carries a little bit more cultural weight with the term, where did this come from? So actually the term itself, patient zero, is actually quite recent. This is a term that originated with the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the mid to late 1980s and actually made its way into the popular lexicon in the 1990s. But though the term itself is relatively recent, its conceptual origins are actually much older. So as primarily a narrative construction, patient zero, as opposed to the epidemiological distinction of index patient, patient zero actually carries centuries of mythic, metaphorical, social, political, and even legal baggage that ends up transforming the innocent, ill-fated index patient into a depraved menace who, through ignorance, indifference, or calculated malice, wantonly seeds an epidemic. So definitely that stigma piece is one of the things that makes patient zero a pretty problematic term and kind of a problematic concept. So what I hope to do in my time with you today is to focus on exploring patient zero's mythic genealogy, tracing the evolution and expansion of this archetype from scapegoat to super spreader to sexually promiscuous villain. And so by attending to representations of gender deviance and sexual promiscuity in patient zero's narrative antecedents, what I'm hoping this talk will do is actually build on previous studies of plague narrative and contagion theory to demonstrate how the myth of patient zero actually problematically reifies heteropatriarchal norms governing gender performance and sexual expression by casting improper, imprudent, and immodest behavior and sexual behavior in particular as punishable with death, or if not death, at least disease. So that is, I think, the thesis of this, and I'm going to hope to convince you of it by the time I'm done talking to you, I guess. And I want us to think about this because this conflation of queerness broadly conceived and epidemiological risk ultimately stigmatizes infectious diseases and those who contract them, while also moralizing susceptibility, infection, and transmission. And so by way of conclusion, I hope to touch a little bit on our, kind of contemporary COVID moment, but also even the monkeypox epidemic would be a really sort of ripe space for conversation around this as well. So while we have an index patient for each outbreak of infectious disease, I said that that patient at zero came about in the 1980s. So our paradigmatic or eponymous patient zero is actually the infamous Quebecois flight attendant Gaetan Dugas, who was maligned for roughly 3 decades as a callous, vindictive super spreader, and who was blamed for bringing HIV to North America. Now, this isn't accurate, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but was actually invented by the journalist Randy Schultz. And this picture of patient zero was central to the publicity campaign for the 1987 bestseller And the Band Played On. It was later made into a movie with Matthew Modine. But Schultz's book identifies Dugas as patient O, which signified outside California in the US Center for Disease Control's 1982 Los Angeles cluster study. So you can see up on kind of the left, almost about center, but center left, there's a black circle with an O in the middle of it. What this study did was mapped possible lines of HIV transmission among 40 gay men with symptoms of late stage AIDS, including the rare cancer Kaposi sarcoma, which Dugas was diagnosed with in 1980. But the other main thing that this study did was establish the sexual transmissibility of AIDS. So we can have a whole other conversation about how ethically messed up it is that Schultz decided to identify an anonymous member of this CDC study as Dugas and pin that on them. But again, that's another topic. So actually, what happened is that repeated misreadings of that letter O as the letter zero is what gave rise to the designation of patient zero. And as the story goes, Schultz decided that this was really the much catchier name, and he ends up using it within his reporting, within the promo for the book itself. And it ends up finding its way into sort of mainstream culture and becoming this term that is recognizable and familiar to many. And what happens as the book and sort of gains steam and the movie then as well is that patient zero first conflated conflates the epidemiological index patient of that CDC cluster study with the index patient for North America writ large, even though the science at the time didn't support that conclusion that Dugas or patient O of this cluster study brought HIV to North America. And that was further proven in 2016. You all might remember there were a lot of headlines around that sort of exonerated Dugas. There was genomic analysis of the virus that proved that it had been circulating in North America well before Dugas would have been infected. But all that aside, it was really too late. And by the late 1980s, the narrative construction of Dugas, or of patient zero, which branded Dugas the man who gave us AIDS, which you can see in the headline of this New York Post article, was then firmly entrenched in the cultural imaginary and an integral element of the story about HIV/AIDS. So patient zero then, this is where the term itself comes from, is with Gaetan Dugas, but is actually distinct from it, right? And this specific instance is just one reiteration of the much larger myth of patient zero. And arguably, the reason that Schultz was able to create this sort of villain out of Dugas is because this story, or this myth of patient zero, reimagines and repurposes the scapegoat of ancient plague myth and fears of the super spreader within contemporary outbreak narrative. And that's a figure that really evolved out of the early 20th century with a lot of the nativist sentiment that we had at that moment of increased immigration, but also with the discovery of healthy carriers and the sort of wide acceptance of germ theory. So where patient zero with capital P, capital Z is this like fictionalized version of Dugas, when we think about patient zero, little p, little z, this is a much broader sort of mythic metaphorical construct that is again connoting this willful, unscrupulous, and iniquitous disease transmitter. So what we can see then, and what I will show, is how the little p, little z sort of a myth of patient zero is something that we can trace back from Dugas to Typhoid Mary, our first known healthy carrier and our sort of archetypical super spreader, and then all the way back to the scapegoat of ancient plague myth. So that really what happens is that the myth of patient zero is something that conflates the three of these, and is actually something that brings together the scapegoat, the super spreader, and, for lack of a better word, and because it alliterates, the slut. Right. So we've got this idea of super spreaders, of sexual promiscuity, of scapegoats that all come together that actually construct our idea of what patient zero is. And, you know, I use that word in describing Dugas because for Schultz, Dugas' sex life is really central to the narrative that he constructs. It creates Dugas as this really sexually rapacious character, and one who is supposedly embittered by his diagnosis and is spitefully rejecting, you know, public health officials' advice and really their recommendation that he abstain from sexual activity. And I think it's important that we pause to kind of complicate that history. So as a participant within the CDC's cluster study, Dugas reported roughly 250 sexual partners a year to the epidemiologists doing that study. And that's pretty much in line with the average of 227 that all of the participants of that study reported. And this is part of this sort of larger culture of bathhouse cruising among North American gay men at the time. What was unique about Dugas is that he was able to provide a list of 72 of his partners to the epidemiologists doing the study. The other people who participated either were unwilling or unable to do that. So there's this horribly cruel irony that by participating in this study and agreeing to give them more information, he provided this fodder for them demonizing him. There's more talk too and more complexity around the sort of refusal to abstain from sex. Until that cluster study had been published, the sexual transmissibility of AIDS was still not confirmed. And Dugas had cancer, which we don't typically understand to be a communicable disease. So he exists within this space of contested scientific knowledge. And so the way that Schultz's narrative then retrospectively denigrates him as being sort of willfully infecting as many people as possible and just being uncareful is really just not truly historically accurate. And this isn't just something that historians have kind of like looked back with the virtue of hindsight to be able to say, hey, that was pretty messed up and that was wrong. Schultz was critiqued pretty vociferously at the time. And so this is a quote from the art historian and queer theorist Douglas Crimp, who wrote a number of essays in the late 80s and early 90s that really just railed against Schultz and the way that he constructed this narrative of HIV/AIDS and the relationship of promiscuity and gay male sexuality within that. So, and then more recently, the historian Richard McKay has done a lot of his historical archival work that has dug up what Schultz knew, what kind of he found out through interviews and other things like that, that has revealed that Schultz was super selective in what he chose to include in the book. And it was only that which really painted Dugas in a pretty terrible light, and not any of the advocacy and outreach work he was doing with local AIDS organizations and all this other stuff that is there to present us with a more complex and nuanced and truly human figure. So what we end up happening is the development of this sort of phobic fantasy that really erases any nuance in Dugas himself and creates this sort of flat character of this patient zero who is not a very flattering picture. Now, this is a narrative, even though it's not wholly historically accurate, that was really compelling and immediately kind of caught on because it was familiar. It was familiar because it confirmed widely held homophobic beliefs regarding gay men's, again, giant scare quotes, deviance throughout the late 20th century. But it also was a familiar narrative because it echoed the vilification of typhoid Mary Mallon, who was our first known healthy carrier of an infectious disease. And actually in And the Band Played On, Schultz dubs Dugas the Quebecois version of Typhoid Mary. So we see that he makes this connection very clearly within the text itself. And this is crucial to him being able to invent a story and invent the character of patient zero within this larger outbreak narrative regarding the HIV/AIDS epidemic. It's what makes the story familiar. It's what makes it catch on and resonate with audiences. So here is our Typhoid Mary in a hospital bed, looking none too pleased about it. Hers was a rather sensationalized case in the early 20th century. She was the first known asymptomatic or healthy typhoid carrier. And because of that, she inadvertently transmitted disease to her employers and to fellow domestic servants through her work as a cook. Epidemiologists have traced roughly 50 cases and 3 deaths to Mallon between 1900 and 1915, at which point she was incarcerated on New York's North Brother Island until her death in 1938. And while she was there, she was sort of participating then in epidemiological studies around the phenomenon of the healthy carrier. I think she gave, blood and stool samples daily, or at least weekly, as they were trying to figure out how one could be a healthy carrier. And, public health authorities, the legal system, popular media, and history have not been particularly kind to Mallon. So just as Dugas was transformed into this character, right, of patient zero, so too is Mallon reduced to this uncharitable effigy, Typhoid Mary, which we use now culturally to respond or to refer to any polluted woman or someone who carries or gives diseases to others. And I have to say, I'm guilty of that as well, and trying to convince my father-in-law to stop going to the grocery store every day. Early in the COVID pandemic, I referred to him as Typhoid Steve or COVID Steve and said he needed to lock it up. But now I feel a little bit bad about that. So just as sexual promiscuity is kind of central to the creation of patient zero as a character, what's really crucial about the creation of Typhoid Mary as a character is this understanding of intentionality. So she was actually arrested twice. One was around 1907, 1908. And was released and identified and told she was a healthy carrier and told she had to stop cooking. Well, she eventually evaded public health authorities and was later found again when she was cooking at the Sloan Maternity Hospital. And there were a couple of deaths recorded there where they found her cooking under a pseudonym, and then they decided to incarcerate her for life. And so there's this sense that she was really unthoughtful, or even just downright malicious, that she was going out and trying to infect people, or she just didn't care whether or not she infected people. But just like Dugas, she's operating and living at this moment of contested scientific knowledge. She's the first known asymptomatic carrier. And as the slide says, it wasn't until 2013 that researchers at Stanford finally really cracked like how that could be possible. And in her private letters sent from North Brother Island, she didn't understand how she could be making people sick when she was never sick and she wasn't currently sick. And so again, working within this space, when we kind of apply our current knowledge to this and like, well, why didn't she know better? And of course, cooking's not a good spot. And why didn't she have better hand hygiene? Germs had just been discovered, and she's the first known one of these. And so that claim of intentionality seems a little bit unfair when we think back in those terms. Nevertheless, she has emerged as our sort of quintessential super spreader, which in epidemiological terms refers just to an individual who infects disproportionately more secondary contexts than other hosts. But just like patient zero, it's actually a cultural designation rather than the sort of clean, neat epidemiological definition. And so, as the folklorist Andrea Kidda demonstrates, it's always tinged by these assumptions of deviance or impropriety. And this was certainly the case for Malin, whose gender, class status, and national origin all colored the public's, the legal systems, and the health authorities' perception of the risk she posed to public health as an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. And I'll note that she immigrated to the US from Ireland in 1883. So in the records, we see that the New York City's public health authorities presumed her to be uneducated and socially inferior. They disapproved of her unwed cohabitation with a male companion, and they disparaged her as masculine and thereby unattractive, which is kind of funny given the photograph that we have on this slide, neither of which appear to be true based on what I can see there. But all of this is to present Malin as someone different, deviant, and unfeminine, as the historian Judith Walzer Levitt argues. And Levitt writes a really fantastic biography of Mary Malin. And says all of this is really to construct her as this aberrant other in order to justify their actions against her. And all of that goes to show, and Levitt kind of unpacks how Malin came to have a very unique or singular kind of treatment. She was not the only known asymptomatic carrier in New York City at the time. I think there were hundreds, if not thousands, that were documented, and yet she was the only one who was incarcerated for life. And while, typhoid Alphonse has, happily made his way into obscurity, we still use the term typhoid Mary, right, to mean this sort of polluted person, this malicious person who is deliberately infecting others. So we see there's a comparison or a similarity here between patient zero as a character and typhoid Mary as a character, who are only somewhat loosely based on the actual historical figures, Gaetan Dugas and Mary Malin. And they become these monstrous characters within these stories of disease emergence and outbreak. Both of them are depicted as knowing and vindictive super spreaders, as promiscuous and thereby socially irresponsible citizens, as deviant and dangerous others. And both are actually then variations on the scapegoat of ancient plague mythology. In the 1974 essay, The Plague in Literature and Myth, René Girard defines the scapegoat as an essential feature of plague narrative. The scapegoat is a random victim upon whom all fascination and hatred is concentrated, the one who must be perceived as a real culprit, missing before and now identified and punished. Girard contends, as Susan Sontag later affirms in Aids and Its Metaphors, that mythic and literary plagues are perceived as punishment for evil, immorality, or political corruption. So though the causes of real world pandemics are both complex and communal, in plague mythology, the entire responsibility for the crisis is collectively transferred upon just this scapegoat. So the invention of a scapegoat doesn't only explain the plague and exonerate the public at the expense of an unlucky dupe, but it also functions as a form of social policing by then punishing what are seen as taboo behaviors. And Girard points to incest and parricide specifically in his study, but we can see that infidelity, homosexuality, and sexual promiscuity are equally punishable threats to cultural cohesion within the framework that he lays out. And so the implication is that disease is a punishment that is justly deserved for indulging in dangerous behaviors. And I think where we should take even more pause and be a little bit more troubled is that this associates disease risk with, again, the so-called deviant behavior, which ultimately warrants the strict policing, if not the outright prohibition of non-normative expressions of sociality and sexuality. Because the understanding or the presumption, right, is that these risky behaviors aren't only endangering the individual who engages in them, but the community at large, because it invites contagion into the community. And so when we think about the myth of patient zero, what's really crammed all together in this is that this is a figure who is a scapegoat. This is someone we see as this super spreader, but also has these hints then of sexual promiscuity. It assimilates all these different kind of fears within them, and so has at its core then the ways that it's stigmatizing anything that is sort of non-normative behavior. So by way of kind of wrapping up, this for me, this history frames a larger project that is forthcoming in the journal Literature and Medicine, which looks at the patient zero narrative arc within the film Contagion and critiques that storyline. So if anybody's watched it and wants to talk about why Gwyneth Paltrow has to have an extramarital affair before dying in the first 5 minutes of the film, I'm here for it. I love that conversation. But I think the warning that we should take away from this, and in terms of thinking about the impact of the history and the conceptual evolution of the myth of patient zero, is that we have to be attuned to where these attuned to and critical of, right, of where these familiar themes and stock characters come from that we then see repurposed in contemporary outbreak narratives, because they're not neutral. They make moral judgments on non-white, homosexual, and or non-male bodies. And these are assumptions that ultimately have consequences. They can affect contagion routes and survival rates. They promote stigma, and they influence our perception of the disease and its consequences. So I think what is most troubling about it is, one, that it ends up then perpetuating these sort of biased, stigmatized ideas about, non-normative identities and behaviors, we could say. But the other is that it distracts us from the kind of bigger picture. And somebody had noted one of the potentially problematic things about patient zero, right, is like, what if we get the wrong one and we go down the wrong rabbit hole? And I think that's precisely it. When we home in and try to figure out who our patient zero is, we lose sight then of the larger context of outbreak and contagious disease. And so what I hope that you all take away from this, right, is that being hesitant to use the kind of terminology or the conceptual sort of framework of patient zero, because if instead of recycling these sexist and homophobic tropes, let's think instead about what it means to be part of an embodied community, how we understand disease risk and social responsibility. So instead of casting blame on the person who did the wrong thing, let's consider what the biopolitical theorist Ed Cohen suggests are the complex scalar connections through which we as living organisms relentlessly weave ourselves into the world, and how our vulnerability and our vitality coexist. So instead of doubling down on narrow hegemonic notions of morality and promiscuity that unjustly stigmatize the ill, let's train our eyes on the structural origins of outbreak and leverage our commune systems, again, per Cohen, to imagine more just and equitable approaches to public health. So I will leave it there. And welcome questions and discussion and anything else.